Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Welcome back to this afternoon's session, which is dealing with matter 15, which relates to housing provision. And both Mr. Hatfield and I, who are the two appointed inspectors for those who have not joined us before, will be taking this session together. Just to make people aware of how we will conduct the session today, particularly for those who have not joined us before. If you wish to speak, please use your hand raise function. If you would keep your phones to silent or put them off, that would be very helpful. And unless you're speaking, you do not need to have your video on. And we do have quite a number of participants for this afternoon's session, so I'd be grateful if you could introduce yourself and who you're representing the first time that you come on to speak. Could I ask Mr. Bull, the partnership team who are going to be speaking in this session, to just introduce themselves, please? I think you're on mute, Mr. Bull.
Thank you, sir. There's myself, Phil Morris, who's just come on the screen, Adam Banham, and Simon Bird is here as well. So this is our team for this afternoon. We'll be taking different questions, different people.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Just a bit of context for this session. We have reduced this session, so half a day from the full day that we had originally earmarked for it. And the reasons for that are explained in the note which the programme officer sent out last week, which I hope everyone has had. But because of where we are on East Norwich in terms of waiting for more information from the partnership, and also because we're still working through our way through the delivery assumptions on sites even today, we have decided that we will not discuss today question 2 or question 4. So that those two relate to the overall housing supply and the 5-year land supply, and we will return to, well, we will deal with those matters later on, once we have had sight of and considered the East Norwich information. And we don't yet know when that will be, but we will be inviting the partnership to give us an update on the potential date when we will get that information. I'm happy to hear from Mr. Bull now. Equally, we know that we've got an admin session with the partnership next week where we're running through some of the progress on some of the outstanding matters of work, simply from an administrative perspective. So I don't know whether Mr. Bull, you're able to update us on any of that now.
Yeah, on the East Norwich, I can update you that you will have the information you requested by the end of the month.
Okay, thank you.
Some of it will be coming on the 11th of March, but it will be completed by the end of the month.
Thank you. And obviously, it's likely that we will tie future hearing sessions in with the other elements that still have to be discussed. The Gypsy traveller work, for example.
Yes.
Thank you. So if we go back to what we're going to discuss today, some of the questions we don't wish to discuss, in that we've not got any questions or very few questions, so we can run through those fairly quickly. Other questions, we expect that we can have a good discussion on them, because we've got some questions that we'd like to explore and seek clarification on. So can I start with question 1, which is about table 6 of the plan, which we did say should this be updated to a base date of April 2021, and in our admin session, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, you explained that D3.2C has actually been updated to April 21. That's correct, isn't it?
That's correct, sir.
So given what I've just explained now about the timetable, in that we're going to have further hearing sessions, not knowing when they are, if we recommend that the plan can be made sound, then the likely adoption of the plan is going to be some time away. And I wonder, Mr. Bull, whether the partnership might be able to update the housing information to bring it forward to a base date of the 1st of April 2022, when that whether that's possible, and what would be the likely timescale if we wanted that to happen.
Yes, sir, that is possible. So we think that it should be updated to 2022. So that would mean row B of table 6 would be amended so that it covered 2018-19 to 21-22. In terms of when we can complete this work, we could possibly complete it by the end of May, but certainly by July at the latest. So we will attempt to update the information with the delivery from 21-22, the housing delivery, as quickly as possible, possibly by May, certainly by July.
So that would effectively bring in all the housing land supply information up to 1st of April 2022.
That's correct.
So that would include the completions bringing forward and also any new permissions.
Yes.
And just to explain, the reason for doing that is so that we can make recommendations based upon the most up-to-date information.
That's certainly our thinking. It would enable us to provide an adopted plan that will have the most up-to-date information possible in it.
Thank you. Before we move off that question, are there any comments that anybody wishes to make in relation to specifically that question? Jonathan Dixon, and then Graham Tuddenham.
Thank you, sir. During the introduction, the camera should do its zooming in trick on me, so apologies for that. It's something I've kind of got stuck with, but hopefully you can hear me okay. There you go. So Jonathan Dixon from Savills. I'm speaking this afternoon on behalf of both Barrett David Wilson and Pigeon Investment Management Limited, and they both raised very much the same point in their written submissions to you, sir, which is quick and discreet, and it goes back to matter 2 where we discussed the housing requirement, and that comes back to row A on this table, because the table isn't just about supply, but it sets out the requirement side as well. So just to reiterate, because there isn't really any other opportunity for us to do so during the examination, that subject to your conclusions on the housing need and requirement matter, then that might affect row A, and we say it does. And that needs updating, and that might then have consequential implications for rows below. But I'll leave that with you, sir. There's no need for me to say anything further.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dixon. Mr. Tuddenham.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So we're still awaiting AMR for 2021, which normally produce us the figures and some reason justification of where the local authority are. I can't quite see how they're going to get it ready by the beginning of May, I think was the suggestion. Bit of a concern, and the concern is we still haven't seen AMR 2021. Can Mr. Burrell enlighten us on that matter, please?
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Burrell did say end of May is possible, but by the end of July is definite.
Yes, that's 20. That's 21, 22. We still haven't
Yes.
had 2021.
Yes.
This is for the housing completion figures.
Yes,
We
but you
will-
need them. You need them to go through the process to put them into an AMR, which will give us the background. All we're going to have is housing numbers. Will we get, for instance, fallout? Will we get affordable? Will we get windfalls? They're all part of this process, I would suggest.
And yes, you will get those.
We will. Fine.
Thank you, Mr. Tuddenham. Thank you, Mr. Bull. Mr. Dixon, you've got your hand up. I don't know whether that was from before.
Apologies, sir. First legacy hand of the afternoon.
Okay, not a problem. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, right. We shall then move just further along. I actually will go to question 10, which is the question about 10%, and we don't have any further questions, Mr. Bull. The information that you've provided to us is helpful. We don't wish to ask any further questions in relation to question 10. Are there any questions from any participants or any comments from any participants in relation to question 10? No. Okay, thank you. Question 3 is about contingency sites. We had what we consider to be a good discussion about contingency sites when we discussed the COSI site, and we don't have any further questions in relation to contingency sites. I'm aware that some participants have made representations about question 3, so I'll just invite if there are any participants who wish to make any additional comments at this stage in relation to question 3. Mr. Turney.
Thank you, sir. Richard Turney for Welbeck. I appreciate you've discussed matters in considering the COSI contingency site, so I'll just make a few very brief points. First of all, as you know from our other representations, we consider that in fact the plan needs to move away from a contingency approach to looking for further allocations to ensure supply throughout the plan period. So in a sense, the contingency question is secondary. Secondly, as we emphasised in both matter 1 and again in dealing with the COSI contingency, our overall submission is that an approach that relies on contingency is not likely to be sound if it only has one contingency option. It's supposed to be dealing with the eventuality that there is under delivery. In other words, there's something happened to supply in a way that's not anticipated. It's not very robust in those circumstances to rely on a single site. And the third point is the point that we made at the outset of this examination about the selection of contingency, the approach to contingency, and the alternatives to contingency, the contingency strategy in the plan, including a range of different sites as contingency should there be supply problems in later parts of the plan. So those are the key points. I won't make the site-specific points because you've heard them already. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turney. Thank you. Mr. Dixon.
Thank you, sir. The points I was going to make have mostly just been made. The one additional point I would make in addition is that if you are looking for contingency sites to address a short-term issue in housing supply, then as has been hinted at just now, you would normally look towards the allocation of or the identification of smaller contingency sites, not a contingency site that's going to take some time to come forward. But again, as you mentioned, so I know you've probably been through all of that in relation to matter 9, so I won't go into it in any further depth here. But suffice to say that we don't support the identification of the COSI contingency site. Thank you, sir.
Hello, we've just lost Inspector Warden for a moment, and I wonder if Mr. Hadfield, you'd be able to assist.
I think on the subject of the contingency sites, that's very much one Mr. Warden prepared for. And obviously, he led the discussion on the Cossey site and the comments that were made at that time. I suspect it would be the best approach to wait for him to come back into the room. As I say, when we were dividing up the work for this this matter, it was very much in Mr. Warden's realm. Was this particular question? I mean, when this has happened before, and it has happened once or twice, he's been able to log back in within a minute or two. That'd be the way I'd suggest we proceed. Indeed.
Should we just turn our cameras off for the moment and not adjourn per se, but just have a short break while we wait for him to come back in? And if it goes on much longer than that, we'll have to have another plan of action. So please bear with us. Thank you. I believe Mr. Warden's back with us now, everybody. Thank you for your patience. Mr. Warden, we just held off doing any adjournments or starting another subject while we waited for you to rejoin us. So you haven't missed anything, and neither has anyone else. Thank you.
I thought you'd all dealt with that question. I'll just come back in and you say thank you very much. Thank you. I apologise for that. It got cut off. I was just hearing from Mr. Dixon.
I'm not sure how much you heard, sir. I didn't have much to say. I was essentially saying that I agreed with Mr. Turney in the comments he made, with the additional rider that, as he hinted at, if you're looking for a contingency site to address a short-term issue, specifically land supply, then you would normally look at a selection or a single site that could deliver houses in the short term, rather than a larger site that might take many years to come forward. And that's why we don't support the identification of the quasi-contingency site as set out in the plan. But again, I know you've probably covered, and in fact, I know you have covered those points under matter 9.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dixon. Mr. Cognan.
Thank you, sir. I'd just like to reiterate some of the points that have been made already by the two commentators there. So it's Darren Cognan on behalf of Rampton Property Trust. The point about obviously contingency sites, as has already been said, clearly you're looking at one large contingency site, which to my mind doesn't potentially address the issue with regard to smaller sites that can be delivered much quicker. And I'd just like to draw your attention to my client's site and the statement that was made at the Reg 19 stage for site GNLP 2176, which is land north of Deerham Road, Honingham. So this is a relatively small site which could come forward quickly. Through previous iterations of the plan process, it's always been a preferred site up to the Regulation 19 stage. I don't want to repeat the hearing statement that's made at Regulation 19 stage. I would hope that obviously you've seen that and you will consider that again. But ultimately, we can see no reason why that site has been effectively thrown out at the last moment. There doesn't appear to be any evidence to suggest why that's taken place. The site itself appears to be sustainable when you look at its status within the settlement hierarchy and how the sustainability appraisal has been considered against this site and other sites, all as contained in the Regulation 19 representation. And we've also provided highways evidence and evidence in relation to diversion of the store bus route. So we can see no reason why this site now cannot come forward and cannot in part help meet any contingency as a site that can come forward quickly in accordance with para 69 of the NPPF. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you, Mr. Cogman. As you'll be aware, we're not considering emission sites. So sites that are not within the plan are not before us.
Excuse me, sir. Can I just raise one issue on that, please? And it's just a point of clarity in relation to a session that I was on last week for Marsham, with your fellow inspector, and the point that was raised by another site there who was not a preferred site. So it's just a sort of point of clarity on that point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Neal.
Thank you, sir. James Neal, representing CPRE Norfolk. So under question 3, you would have seen CPRE's submissions about whether or not it's justified to include contingency sites within the plan. I'd just like to emphasise the 4 points we've made. I mean, firstly, given the excessive allocation based on housing potential not need, and I'm not going to go over points we made at matter 2, but of course CPRE's position is that there cannot possibly be any basis for a further contingency site approach or policy as used in this plan. Secondly, and this is a slight nuance on what Mr. Turney and I think Mr. Dixon are saying, that there's no actual justification for a single site approach as opposed to a phasing or reserve strategy. And I'm just going to, and I'll come back to that point. Thirdly, CPRE says that the approach adopted to contingency sites here is contrary to the NPPF and PPG. We've asked where support for this approach can be found in those in national policy and national guidance. And we look for an answer for that, please, from Mr. Morris. And then finally, it's entirely unclear how the actual trigger for the contingency site will actually be met. Now, if I could just come back to the first point, no need for contingency sites due to the pre-existing excessive allocation. This all comes back, of course, to the question of the flexibility allowance and the justification for that. But that is that in excessive inverted commas contingency, we say is more than ample given given what we've already heard about the housing target of 4,000 units actually becoming the requirement, and we heard the clarification for that in matter 2. So there's already a massive amount of, in effect, contingency built into the housing numbers already relied on by the partnership. The second point, no justification for a single site approach as opposed to a phasing or reserve strategy. Now, the developers will say there needs to be further allocation, but we say, well, in effect, if you've got this so-called flexibility allowance of 5,000 dwellings sort of baked into the housing numbers, those units or units up to that number should in effect all be designated as contingency sites and only built out if required. And I'd just like to remind you of what the partnership actually said in terms of that additional flexibility allowance of 5,000. They said that they've been included to allow for higher household and economic growth should they be required. And you can see the references to that on page 2 of our position statement. And again, there's a reference to a higher delivery buffer plus additional flexibility to allow for higher levels of growth. So if one was to follow that through logically, there should be, in effect, a phasing approach to allow for those greater numbers across the board, 5,000, not just one site, to address that flexibility allowance. So we say that it's a systemic problem with the way the council has approached contingency, that particular contingency, i.e. higher growth due to economic circumstances and to cater for that higher level of growth. Thirdly, I've already made the point, and you see in our position statement about the NPPF and PPG, and we look forward to seeing where the justification and national policy for this approach is. And then finally, we do make the point that the policy or the approach, such as there is very unclear. I'm not going back to the specifics of why the cost of seaside has been allocated and the appropriateness of that, but the reference to the trigger to bringing forward that contingency site just simply says if delivery of housing in the GLP area does not meet local plan targets. We don't understand how actually that trigger will be pulled or will be met, because there's no date set on it. We don't know if that's just a breach of the housing delivery target on an annual basis. It's just the actual policy or approach in itself at 7.1 in relation to cost of sea is extremely unclear, and that's perhaps a point of detail. But the three other points I've made are systemic problems in the way this contingency site approach has been adopted by the partnership. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Neil. Mr. Bonner.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, James Bonner from Barton Wilmore on behalf of Terra Strategic, who are promoting contingency site. We've discussed most of this in earlier sessions, so I won't go over that. Just to reiterate, we've referred to successful examples elsewhere of recently adopted plans, such as North Warwickshire, who have used reserve sites or contingency sites, and that's over and above the flexibility of their supply as well. The site itself is in a sustainable location at the top of the settlement hierarchy. It's available, it's unconstrained, deliverable and developable. In terms of the concern of one big site versus numerous smaller sites, this site can be delivered in phases from one or more accesses simultaneously. Doesn't require a significant lead-in time. So in our view, the principle of the contingency sites in general, and in this site in particular, is justified. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bonner. Mr. Morris, are you going to come back on the partnership for the partnership on this? If you could please help us with those points made, particularly those 3 points posed by Mr. Neil.
Yes, sir. The contingency site is, of course, part of our overall package, our overall strategy that delivers flexibility. And alongside that is the extra provision within the plan. That partly answers the question of why only one site. Well, we have a significant flexibility in our buffer and a single contingency site is over and above and on top of that buffer. So the alternative of many small sites, well, in an area like this, to achieve the same level of growth of about 800 dwellings would require multiple contingency sites. And we don't feel that's necessary because we already have a very wide range, wide distribution of sites across the plan area. In terms of Mr. Neil's, I think, three main points. The NPPF seeks to ensure housing is delivered. It does not preclude the use of contingency sites or reserve sites. We've decided that as part of our strategy, a contingency site will aid our delivery. That is not inconsistent with the NPPF or the PPG. And as Mr. Bonner drew our attention to, there are successfully adopted plans that include reserve sites. So it's not something that has been found to be unsound elsewhere. Phasing sites to achieve what Mr. Neil would like to see, from our position, would artificially constrain the market, and it would actually take away the flexibility and choice that we think is necessary to deliver growth in what were very uncertain times and are currently even more uncertain in terms of the economy and growth. I think that deals with Mr. Neil's points as far as I've noted them down. I just back on the single site. This isn't really a discussion, I don't think, about the site. We've had that, but it probably is worth pointing out that the site is very well located. It's adjacent to sites that have delivered or are delivering, and it's very close to employment opportunities both at Longwater and at Norwich Research Park. So it's very likely, or we would expect, housing on this site to be very attractive to purchasers, and would therefore deliver out quickly. And as Mr. Bonner said, there's no significant constraints to bringing the site forward. Indeed, if it wasn't capable of allocation, it wouldn't serve the purpose of being a contingency site, because there would be too many unknowns. So I think that's addressed the point, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Neil, would you just like to come back on that? You've got your hand
I'm
up.
grateful, sir. I won't come back on the substance of what Mr. Morris has said in relation to the three initial points I've made. The other than saying that this point about artificially constrain the market, I don't think one can find a reference to that in the evidence base at all. But other than that point, the one question that has gone unanswered is there's just a particular point about the trigger and for bringing forward the contingency site, where it says it does not meet local plan targets. And I just like it may be something we're missing. It may have been discussed earlier in relation to this particular site, but we just like clarification on how in practice that is actually going to work.
Mr. Morris, can you assist us here?
I think the trigger mechanism was part of the discussion that we had on the Cossey site, and it was something that you, sir, had some concerns about, and we're going to be rethinking or thinking about the effectiveness of the trigger mechanism. So I don't think there's much point me trying to defend once again the trigger that was discussed previously.
Thank you. Mr. Tuddenham.
Thank you, sir. I'll try not to repeat what other people have said, but basically I align myself with Richard Turney in that the plan needs to move away from contingency to certainty, and that certainty is dependent upon the site's ability to come forward. The Cossey site, and again I'll be very brief on this, I made the point that the whole of the site sits in the Norwich Southern Bypass Landscape Protection Zone, and clearly that is a constraint on the site, whereas there are a number of sites that have no such constraints that were just eliminated between between 18 and 19. Forgot the word now. Regulation 18 and 19 just omitted for no reason that would actually stand up. It's just a choice that they've decided to make. And the beauty of other sites that sit on the A11 tech corridor next door to Hethel are clearly of advantage, and clearly where there's also a train station available.
Mr. Turner, we're not discussing alternative sites.
I haven't mentioned an alternative site. I mentioned an alternative location, sir. Sorry, I haven't mentioned the site. I don't intend to.
Thank you.
But you have to, when you reassess, it should go back to consider what was eliminated and what has already been assessed, and then select the best site. And that is a matter that has to go back to a complete fresh discussion, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tuddenham. Mr. Hook.
Thank you, sir. I just emphasise a point that Mr. Neil raised. I just draw attention to paragraph 115 of the topic paper Policy 1 Growth Strategy. That's document 3.1, which was talking about the flexibility allowance to allow for higher levels of growth. Sentence reads, it is a potential figure, this allowance, as illustrated in the housing trajectory in Appendix 4 of this topic paper, if the market for these additional homes does not materialise, they will not be provided. It is entirely logical, therefore, that if the market does not materialise for the houses, then there is no need for the sites to materialise, and it would save countryside and save greenfield sites if they were not provided. Therefore, if they are needed, yes, put them in the plan, but please treat them as phased reserve sites, only to be brought forward if needed. It's clear that they think they may not be needed, therefore they should only be included as reserve sites.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hook. I'm just going to ask Mr. Morris if he wants to say anything in response to any of those points made, and then I shall move off.
I don't want to take your time, so I think we've dealt with the points that have been raised. All their site-specific points that were dealt with earlier.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your comments on the contingency sites approach. Can we move to question 5, please? And this is, are the assumptions for homes to be delivered on existing commitments justified? And will 31,452 homes be delivered on these sites between April 2020 and 2038? I'm just going to ask a question in relation to the response that the partnership has made, and then Mr. Hatfield has got some more detailed questions in relation to particular sites. So I'm not sure I follow from what has been said in the partnership statement, and perhaps you could take me through this, the difference between what you referred to as moderated supply and potential supply. Mr. Banham, is that?
Hello, sir. Yes, I can give some explanation to that. It's essentially the difference between delivery with or without the full number of homes on a handful of sites. So there's a few sites, namely Beeston, North Rackheath and Long Stratton, that under the moderated supply deliver beyond 2038. But obviously there is potential, should market conditions allow, etc., that those 3 sites do complete by 2038.
So these are the sites at Beeston, these are sites that you've listed, the total of 2,145. So these are Beeston Park, North Rackham and Long Stratton, because in your view they will deliver beyond the end of the planned period, but so that is moderated supply. And then what you're saying is if market conditions are favourable, effectively they could be brought forward earlier than you might anticipate, and therefore that's the potential supply.
Yes, that's correct.
So can you just tell me then how those 2 figures relate to the figures within the plan?
What section of the plan?
Well, so the 48,132, where would that be? Where would that appear in the plan?
That's an updated figure. So the figures in the submitted plan talk about 49,500, I believe it was, as the total potential housing supply. That was prepared at the beginning of 2021. The figures that you've been looking at in relation to the trajectory D3.2C is a trajectory that was prepared at November 2021. So the lapse in time, with obviously housing supply changing almost on a daily basis, is the difference in the figures.
I mean, we will come on to this when we come back to a later session on overall housing land supply, but just so I can understand that. So if we look at table 6 within the in appendix 6 of the table within appendix 6 of the plan, and the 49492 is what you were saying now, is that because of the work that you did in relation to 3.2c, that figure should be 48132.
Yes, that's correct. So the figures in the table 6 of the plan were based on the numbers we had at the end of 2020, and the figures that you've got before you with the housing trajectory are the figures that we had in November 2021. And obviously, as Mr. Borrell was discussing with you earlier, we would look to provide a new trajectory which took into account completions in 21-22 and any further information we had on permissions or indeed the delivery of allocations in the spring summer.
So in terms of 49,492 being the expectation based upon your realistic assumptions and judgment as to what the figure would be by 2038, there is a reduction of around about 1,300.
Well, in some ways the figure did slightly go up because the potential figure just came to 50,000, which I believe we quoted in the November 21 work.
Right. But I'm comparing the 48,132 to the 491,492. I know we won't be able to properly do that until we get an updated housing figures, but I'm looking to see what you're saying is that the 49,492 actually, because of the work you've done, would come down if you're looking at the figures now, not what we're going to look at in terms of 1st of April 2022. Is that correct?
Yes, because obviously the commitment is going down as sites with permission build out. So it's a sort of ever-changing position, I would suggest.
But the bottom line has got delivery. So delivery is included in that 49 and will be when we update it to 1st of April 22.
Yes, I understand. Yeah, I understand. That's correct, sir. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Hatfield, have you got any questions on this particular matter before I ask anyone else if they've got questions on this particular issue? And then, Mr. Hatfield, you've got some further questions in relation to commitments.
I think it'd just be helpful from my perspective to understand where that change in it amounts to around 1,300 units. Are there any sites in particular that led to that change? It's quite a big loss to the total housing supply of the plan period. It'd be helpful for me if Mr. Banham could just briefly outline where those losses were incurred. Thank you.
It's difficult for me to remember the specific sites where there was change. So obviously, even small sites may move by a few dwellings between a outline and a reserved matters permission.
I understand that, Mr. Banham, but were there any kind of big headline losses within that figure?
I don't recall in detail. Obviously, and this is clear from our evidence, we are very mindful of the 3 big existing allocations: Beeston, Rackheath and Long Stratton, and there has been some changes over those sites in terms of who they're being promoted by. So I can't remember specific numbers, but there were changes there. And obviously we're very mindful of the situation around, for example, East Norwich and Anglia Square.
Okay. I mean, I do intend to go into those sites now, so we can perhaps pick that up on a site-by-site basis. Obviously, there are a number of sites allocated in various area action plans that are not allocations in this plan, but which are heavily relied upon as part of this plan's housing land supply. Just before we do move on to some of those sites, I did note as a general point that statements of common ground hadn't been prepared in relation to them. Was there a reason for that approach?
The basis of the housing trajectory is the existing monitoring work. So we, for the November 21 trajectory, we used the as the basis of that, the work that had been prepared for the 5-year land supply work. We then obviously extrapolated those sites that were in the 5-year land supply statement and looked across the entire plan period to 2038. And then of course we layered on top, if you like, the new GNLP allocation. So you can sort of see in the spreadsheet, there's a sort of pattern where you see the GNLP allocations at the top, and then commitment sites tend to sort of follow below.
But why were statements of common ground? I mean, the point I'm driving at really is for each of the GNLP allocations, the statements of common ground, or certainly for most of them, with the respective site promoters or landowners setting out in effect that those sites are available and deliverable, and providing some detail about the way in which they'll be phased in many cases. Why was no equivalent process gone through with the larger area action plan sites, which I understand they're not allocated in this plan, but this plan does rely on them in terms of delivery of its target and its requirement?
Yes, the underpinning the monitoring work is a series of joint delivery statements. So for each of the existing allocations as part of the annual monitoring work and the 5-year land supply work, each developer with an existing commitment is contacted and they're asked to prepare joint delivery statements. So those delivery statements sit within the annual monitoring work and the 5-year land supply work.
Okay. Okay.
They're in a sense sort of two similar things with different names.
Just before we start on the individual sites, then, are there any comments from around the room on what we've just heard? Okay, thank you. I do want to look at a number of the sites allocated in the area action plans. We'll start with the largest one, which is the Growth Triangle Area Action Plan. And we'll start within that area action plan on the Beeston Park site. As I understand it, that site has outlined consent, but no reserve matters have yet been approved. Is that the correct position, Mr. Bannon?
That is the case, sir. So the outline consent, I believe, was given in 2018. Since then, we've monitored progress of the site closely. There has recently been some changes in terms of the ownership and promotion of the site. So as I understand, the various landowners of the site, which includes Norfolk County Council, have now resolved to sell the site to the site in its entirety to a single developer. At the moment, who that developer is, I believe, is confidential. But nevertheless, despite that, progress has been made on the site. So, for example, there is a application in at the moment which is due to be determined shortly in the next couple of months, most likely, that will deal with things such as the east-west link road, and that infrastructure will be crucial to unlocking the site. As you'll probably be aware, along with the outline consent, there's been considerable master planning work done, work also on drainage, and therefore we're confident that reserved matters applications can both be submitted quickly and determined quickly.
And as I understand it, the pending reserve matters application relates solely to the provision of infrastructure. That's correct, isn't it?
That's correct, sir. Yes.
Okay. You also mentioned that there's one house builder. Does that imply a single outlet rather than multiple outlets in terms of delivery?
No, this is a scheme that's long been envisaged as a sort of simultaneous multi-phase scheme, and I don't know the details, but my understanding from speaking to colleagues is that the new developer will parcel up the land and bring other developers into the scheme as well. I suspect this will be a site which would lend itself to two, but most probably three simultaneous outlets.
But you mentioned that the site had been disposed to a single developer. Is it? I mean, I appreciate it's confidential. I don't wish to encourage you down the route of breaching that. But there are some developers that have multiple arms. I won't name them. And multiple outlets under the same company. I suppose the question I've got is what certainty is there that there will be multiple outlets? I mean, it might be that a site lends itself to multiple outlets, but that doesn't dictate that there will be multiple outlets. Do you have clarity at this stage that multiple outlets will be progressed?
No, I don't, sir. I don't know who that single developer is, so I couldn't even disclose it accidentally. My understanding is, though, speaking to colleagues, that there are discussions going on about how more than one developer could be brought to the site.
Okay. It's envisaged at present that this site will deliver 25 units in the next financial year. What milestones are assumed before this site can begin to deliver completions in order to achieve that?
Yes, there's obviously been a considerable amount of change with this site over recent months. I think your earlier question, sir, implied the answer. There's not been reserved matters applications determined as yet. I believe they could come forward and be determined quickly, sir, for the reasons I've previously said, but that would strike me as a key milestone that needs to be achieved.
And what about the provision of infrastructure? Obviously, I don't have the reserve matters application before me, but you did mention a spine road would be provided that, in your words, would unlock the site. So would that need to be installed first before a significant number of sort of dwellings could be provided?
Yes, my understanding is that the current application will be determined soon, and construction on the east-west link road would in likelihood be happening next year.
And does that application include other necessary highway improvements to accommodate a scheme of this size?
I'm not familiar with the full detail of the scheme, sir. I believe there are other elements to the proposal, and I believe that there are drainage aspects as well to the site, to the scheme, which would again facilitate development happening quickly.
I mean, when you start itemising all of the elements, I'm thinking purely in terms of lead-in times here. You start itemising all of the elements that are required to be delivered. Obviously, you've got the pending reserve matters application for infrastructure, including the spine road. Obviously, that would then need to be built out and constructed, and potentially, certainly on a scheme of this size, you'd be surprised if there wasn't off-site highways works and other infrastructural works to be completed. There'll be conditions to discharge. A new reserve matters application necessary for at least the first phase of housing. Then they need to approve that, and then to get construction started before units could deliver. I mean, 25 next year is not realistic, is it?
I don't think it is. So I think if I was drafting this trajectory today rather than last autumn, I would probably push this site back by a year or possibly two.
What would be the basis of pushing it back 1 year rather than 2? I mean, it's been put to me, for example, by Halsbury Homes, who may wish to comment, that delivery shouldn't be assumed until 28-29, whereas you're assuming delivery next year. Although I think that's accepted, it's not feasible realistically. Certainly delivering the following year as well may be considered ambitious. It's a very, very large site. It's not clear from the information before me quite how much work would need to be undertaken in terms of infrastructural works, upfront infrastructural works, before the first houses could come on stream. It isn't clear at this stage when the first reserve matters application for housing is going to land, unless you can add anything to that.
No, I can't. So I think this is probably a site where once we've gathered more details about who the new buyer is for the site, we will know more. Although, as I said before, work in relation to the strategic infrastructure on the site is nevertheless progressing. The
application is progressing, but presumably it hasn't been commenced because it would require the approval unless there was something allowed with the outline permission.
Yes, I misspoke there. The approval hasn't been given yet to that application. Having spoken to the case officer this morning, he anticipated that it could be issued within the next couple of months.
And that's for the infrastructural element of things.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, and we've talked about lead-in times. In terms of annual delivery rates, a figure of 150 is used. What's that? What assumptions underpin that annual completion rate, assumed annual completion rate?
We've used that or a sort of similar rate for a couple of the other large strategic sites. That's based on typically 2 or 3 outlets operating simultaneously. So that is a reflection of Lichfield's start to finish type work, and also estimates and build out rates that we've seen from other sites locally.
Okay. Does anyone wish to comment on lead-in times and annual rates of delivery? I'm aware there's a few people who've made comments on this particular point in their hearing statements. There's a hand raised that it says meeting to me. Was that Halsbury or Mr. Chung?
Yes, good afternoon, sir. It's Halsbury. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Ah, yes. Good afternoon, sir. It's Halsbury Homes, Mr. Chung, Mr. Spry, and Ms. Pugh. It's Mr. Spry who wants to address you, sir, on this point.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So I think the points made by Mr. Banham are helpful in terms of updating on the position for Beeston Park as a whole. But in a sense, what that updating does is just confirm how much we don't now know about when and in what form this site will come forward. There has been media reports about the new, I think in media terms referred to as a mystery buyer of the site, but we don't know whether that's a master developer or a house builder. We don't know on what basis the site has been acquired and with what underlying strategy. And just for context for this, this is a site where there are 3 phases, and phases 2 and 3 were reliant on further phases of infrastructure being provided, and there was a housing infrastructure fund bid that was submitted to government to help unlock the site, which wasn't successful in securing the necessary funding. And the pro forma that was returned by the original promoters for this site as part of the housing land supply submission for 2019-2020 said that without public sector funding, the landowners and promoters will need to consider their strategy. Now, that reconsideration of strategy may well have occurred or be in the process of occurring in terms of this new buyer being in place, but we don't know what that new strategy is. We don't know whether a solution has been found to the funding for the necessary infrastructure and on what delivery basis the site is now being advanced. So, you know, perhaps one might take comfort that a new buyer and developer will be in place. We don't know it's actually in place now, but will be in place. But precisely what that means for lead-in times or the build-out rates, to be frank, sir, there isn't any evidence before this examination to say what a reliable trajectory for that site should be.
Thank you, Mr. Spry. In your hearing statement, or in Lichfield's hearing statement, the lead-in times are shown as the first year of delivery being 2028-29. What was the reason for you taking that approach on this site?
Effectively, we took the view that although the site has a history that goes back to 2016, the original outline application, not 2018, that there had been a visible lack of progress with the site on that basis, and therefore we applied effectively the start to finish lead-in times for a site which, I can't remember the precise number now, but effectively it's a long lead-in time absent any evidence to suggest that good progress is being made to bring forward that first phase. And then on the build rates, because as we understand it, only phase 1 in a sense is on the table as a deliverable, potentially deliverable prospect. The build out would be based on a site of 733, which on start to finish averages would be 68 per annum, rather than applying the average build rates for a much larger site, because of the infrastructure barriers to site. In practical terms, it is only a site of 733 at the present time, rather than being a larger site, because that larger site has inherent uncertainties associated with it. But
So,
I mean,
sorry,
just to conclude, I think we've put in those averages as a proxy absent the good evidence that we would expect there to be for a site of this nature and with the history that it has of problems with delivery.
Okay, thank you. And the question I was going to ask you was, so therefore your assumptions for this site, as displayed in your hearing statement, those exclude in effect phases 2 and 3.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there's a few points to pick up there, Mr. Banham. Did you wish to respond to the points Mr. Spride made, particularly in relation to the lack of clarity regarding a appropriate lead-in time annual build-out rate at this stage, in the first instance. And in the second instance, which is a matter I was going to come on to, the point about phases 2 and 3, the failure of a recent bid to the Housing Infrastructure Fund, or the fact that bid was unsuccessful, and the implications of that for phases 2 and 3. So those points, please, would be response would be appreciated. Thank you.
My understanding from speaking to colleagues is that the new developer for the site wouldn't be relying on public investment for the strategic infrastructure. The second point, forgive me, was around lead-in times. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think I would just revert back to my previous comments that this is a site that, given the changes, we would have to give further thought to. And then I think the third point, if I remember correctly, was around later phases. I don't have any further information to add on that, I'm afraid.
Well, I think the later phases is a critical point, because when we talked about lead-in times, we talked about building rates, our rates, and I think I'll need to take a view on those. I think I'll say at this stage that I think, as an absolute minimum, it would need to be pushed back 2 years, the first year of delivery, based on what we've discussed. I'll need to reflect and perhaps discuss with Mr. Warden separately the annual rate of delivery. But I think the point about latter phases is key, really, because I think, as Mr. Spry's outlined, the 733 dwellings in phase 1, and it's the latter phases 2 and 3 that would deliver the rest of the contribution to the local plan supply from this site. And if a very significant bid for funding was considered to be necessary, but which was unsuccessful, then does that imply a significant viability gap, or a significant funding gap, at least, for the later phases, such that it would potentially call into question their ability to contribute to the local plan supply?
I suppose the only really point I can add to that is the new buyer, I understand, is buying the entire site, so including later phases.
Okay. Halsby had their hand raised a second ago. Did they wish to make a supplementary point on this site?
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think we were aware of the acquisition of the whole site, but I think, in a sense, that reinforces the uncertainty, because the fact that there had been a housing infrastructure bid made suggests that the original scheme had a significant viability gap, if you like, to deliver the necessary infrastructure. To overcome that without the security of that funding being available would suggest a change in strategy for the development, of which we know not what it is. And that change in strategy, for example, to address that funding gap, might, for example, be a requirement for a new outline permission. You know, the fundamental nature of the scheme may have had to change in order to deliver the scheme without the confidence public sector money via HIF. And until we know the answers to that question, what is the strategy for delivering the whole site without public sector funding, if indeed that is possible? It's very difficult to draw any conclusion about, whether the site could even start delivering within 2 years, for example. There's just simply too much unknown to arrive at a conclusion either on when the site specifically will begin, Because if it needs a new outline, then we're into a whole new ball game, aren't we, in terms of the planning process? And then, you know, what scale of development overall could be expected over the lifetime of the plan? So, I mean, hopefully, you know, the council can help answer some of those sort of questions, but it just seems we none of us really know enough at the moment to have any confidence as to what figures will get put into this trajectory, either in terms of when they start or what the actual numbers would be.
So if I could just add to that, given that they're relying on this site, and it's a big site, and big numbers are put into the plan, I mean, one would expect that there to be a promoter sat around the table at the local plan examination saying, I am the promoter of this site, this is my strategy, this is what I propose to do, it's viable, it's going to work, I don't need public sector funding, or I do need it, and this is when it's going to come on stream. We just don't have any of that.
Okay, thank you. Does the partnership wish to respond to any of those points that have been raised?
Yes, I mean, I accept the issues around the unknown new developer for the site, but my understanding from speaking to colleagues is that the new developer would commit to the existing master plan and outline permission for the site, and that they are able to bring forward the site without the HIF funding that was applied for by the previous promoter.
Why was that necessary in the first instance? But why would there be a change in situation that would mean a site needed a funding grant of that magnitude? Why would a change of a promoter lead to a situation where that wouldn't be required?
I'm afraid I can't answer that in detail. I'm not privy to the circumstances of the previous and the new promoter.
Well, there must have been a bid for the public funding that presumably at least one of the partner authorities would have supported.
Yes, the HIF funding bid from memory was around 2017, 2018, I believe.
And presumably the partnership were involved in that funding bid.
That's correct.
And there would have presumably been a financial case to support it, to demonstrate that it was necessary, that the partnership would have had sight of. So it would have been aware of the reason why that money was needed.
Yes, I don't have that documentation in front of me at the moment, though, sir.
I don't know if I can help. So the HIF bid was a county council bid because of the size of it, and it was essentially needed to speed up delivery and provide a funding mechanism for upfront funding. As Mr. Bannerman said, we are informed that the buyer, who must have taken account of all these issues when they decided to purchase, has deep enough pockets to not require that funding. So it wasn't a case of funding because the site is unviable in principle. It was about speeding up delivery.
Okay. Okay. I think I've heard all I need on that site. In which case, I want to move on to another site within the Growth Triangle Area Action Plan, and that's the North Rack Heath site. I understand from document 3.2, which is the trajectory, that this site has now been acquired by a national house builder. Sorry, not the trajectory, it's the appendix to the topic paper. Does the partnership know how many outlets will operate from this site? Because it says national house builder rather than house builders plural.
Yes, we've been in contact with Taylor Wimpey, who are promoting the site. The information that I've had provided to me suggests that, or does say in fact, that Taylor Wimpey would be able to build up to 300 homes per year, but they themselves say that the most likely delivery rate for this site would be in the region of 150 to 200 homes per annum. Their sort of estimated timeline for moving forward with the site is to have a planning application with the local authority imminently, and to sort of gradually get to a stage of the first occupation of the homes being in Q2 of 2025. So they would be looking to move to Section 106 signing in Q2 of 2023, and completing reserved matter pre-commencement conditions in Q3 of 2023. From speaking to colleagues this week, I understand that this sort of timetable is still on track, and as I said before, the application from Taylor Wimpey is expected imminently.
Okay. And are you aware how many outlets they would operate on the site? Have they disclosed that information to you?
Yes, they've said that they would operate 2 or 3 different outlets with an average of 70 units per opening.
And so if I can understand the difference between the assumed annual rates here and at the Beeston Park site we just discussed, obviously it's 175 per annum here, 150 per annum at Beeston Park. So Beeston Park was about applying a more general assumption, if I've understood you correctly, whereas North Rackheath is applying the tailored rate of delivery, which you've been informed of by the developer.
Yes, exactly, the Taylor Wimpey rate, if you like, yes.
Okay. Halsbury, Mr. Spry, or I hope you don't mind if I just refer to Halsbury. Halsbury, given there's 3 of you.
Yes.
Did you wish to come in on the points that have been made? I've seen your submission and your assumed or rates per annum.
Yes, please. So before we move on to the assumed rates of supply, just want to say that since we wrote our matter statement, there's a matter that needs updating, which is, of course, as you would have seen in the written submissions, we have an application in on this site. And as a result of that, we've had meetings with the council very recently, and it's been made clear to us by the council in no uncertain terms that they would resist any application on this site that does not come forward in accordance with a master plan, which is agreed between all of the landowners, the people controlling the site. And that, of course, is Halsbury and Taylor Wimpey. So the council have made it clear that there should be an agreed master plan, agreed amongst all of the landowners, backed up by a land equalisation arrangement. Now, none of that exists at the moment. We are firmly of the view that this requirement that the council are, or rather this obstacle that the council are putting up to an allocated site is unacceptable and unnecessary. But be that as it may, of course, you're not here to determine that difficulty between us, that disagreement between us. What is relevant for present purposes is that that disagreement exists, and the council are clear that they would not approve any application, whether that be the application that we have submitted or the imminent application that Mr. Banham is alluded to coming in from Taylor Wimpey, that they would be saying no to both of those. Now, if that is the council's position, and that's what they told us their position is, we don't understand how they can assume delivery from this site in 25-26. That disagreement would first have to be resolved. And as matters stand at present, the only way we can see that being resolved is through some form of appeal. And if that's the case, we're not going to see delivery in 25-26. So I don't know what the council position is on that, so before we talk about delivery rates.
And just for clarity, Mr. Chung, is that or perhaps Mr. Banham, is that requirement for a master plan embedded within a policy in the area action plan?
Well, so we say no. We say that's a misinterpretation of the policy, and that it's completely wrong. We say there's plenty of appeal decisions to confirm this, that you shouldn't be holding up the delivery from an allocated site, awaiting all of the landowners to agree. What you should be doing is to have a master plan, and provided an application doesn't prejudice the policy requirement, the policy requirements set out within the policy, you should judge that application on its merits. That is a position the council are not prepared to accept. So as matters stand, delivery on this site is stalled because the council aren't willing to grant a planning application either to us or to Taylor Wimpey.
Mr. Banham, do you want to come back on those points?
I know from the area action plan policies there were requirements for master planning at North Rackheath, but I'm afraid I've not been involved in the development management discussions between Halsbury and Taylor Wimpey, so I'd have to go away and gather some more information before I could give a definitive answer, I'm afraid.
Can you draw my attention to the policy for this site? I mean, is it GC16? I've got the area action plan open. You'll be relieved to hear I'm not going to give a view on whether a master plan is or isn't required. I just want to see what it says.
It is GT16, sir.
Okay. There is at least reference to a master plan, and that presumably hasn't been submitted or agreed at this stage. And there's a dispute over whether it's required prior to the first application. Okay. And you're not in a position, Mr. Banham, to either confirm or refute what Halsbury have put forward with regards to this position, this impasse that's been reached?
I'm sorry, sir. I'm just not aware of the situation here in enough detail to make comment.
Well, that puts me in a difficult position, as you'll understand, Mr. Banham.
Yes.
Because you ran through the milestones that would need to be hit in order for delivery to commence in 25-26, and at least in the hearing statements that Halsbury put forward, that delivery date wasn't at least at that stage challenged. They also had the first year of delivery in 25-26. The difference there was about annual rates of delivery, but if it might be that Halsbury's positions has changed if there's now acknowledged to be at least 2 outlets on the site with Halsbury and, apologies if I say Halsbury, I'm afraid that's my northern roots showing up, which probably isn't how it's pronounced down here. But it might be the case that Halsbury take a different view on the annual completion rates, but also on the lead-in times. I'll take a comment, seeing as there's a hand raised.
Yes, sir. Our position is clear that if the council are willing to confirm that they don't require this participated master plan all signed up by all of the landowners and some sort of land equalisation agreement, if they are prepared to accept that that is not necessary and that they're willing to look at applications on their own merits, we would accept that the delivery rates of 175 can be delivered from this site. But the council can't have it both ways. They're from 25-26, but the council can't have it both ways. They can't say when we go and see them at a development control meeting that they're going to oppose any planning application on this site, either from us or Taylor Wimpey, and say to this local plan examination that you should assume a delivery of 175 dwellings in 27-28, starting in 25-26, because you can't have it both ways.
Thank you, Mr. Chung. I think the lack of clarity on the council's position is not helpful at present. Obviously, if this is a matter that needs to be resolved at appeal, then that will very significantly affect the timescales. And if it is indeed the relevant council's position that any master plan needs to be agreed up front, that will also delay delivery on any part of the site controlled by Taylor Wimpey.
Sir, could I just add, I think it would be a relatively quick exercise for us to provide you with an updated note, if you would welcome that. And I believe at this moment, Mr. Bird would like to come in with a comment, if that's okay.
By all means, yeah, Mr. Bird.
So yes, I mean, I think there is a risk that we're going to be dragged into negotiating in a development management context. This point has only arisen today for the first time. And I think, as Mr. Banham has said, we'll come back to you with a note just setting out what the factual position is and whether or not that has any bearing on the trajectory.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bird. I think as with elsewhere, a note's the only way I can see we'll deal with it at this stage. And this matter was raised, I believe, in the Halsbury Homes letter that came in earlier this week, so it isn't entirely new. But I think given where we are where we are, and this is probably a matter that can be briefly addressed in a way that perhaps the Beeston Part 1 can't. I'll accept a note on that point then. Again, I don't need any introduction or context. It just needs to be a very brief, concise, bullet-pointed note which addresses the key points under contention. Okay, it's approaching 3:30. We've been going since 2, and this is normally the time we would break in the middle of the afternoon. We've still got quite a lot to cover, albeit there is a session potentially at the reconvened hearings where we can go over any matters we don't pick up. I think in that context, we'll break for 15 minutes, or just over 15 minutes to 15:45. We'll come back. There's a couple more sites I wanted to explore at the Growth Triangle Area Action Plan, as well as a couple on the Long Stratton Area Action Plan. So the hearing is adjourned for now. We'll return at 15:45. Thank you. Okay, it's now 3:45 and time to resume the hearing sessions. Okay, before the break, we covered the first two sites in the Growth Triangle Area Action Plan. Just before we go on, I just wanted to make the point that we do have quite a lot to cover today in this session. And whilst there is the potential to move some of it into the reconvened session on housing land supply, I'd like to cover as much as we can today. So just with that in mind, I'd ask all participants to keep their comments focused and concise. There's no need, for example, to simply note your agreement with a previous speaker or to provide much in the way of introduction or context. Please don't feel that you're unable to make a comment. I want to hear comments when people have them to make, but please keep them focused on the issue under discussion. Okay, bearing that in mind, we'll move on to another site in the Growth Triangle Area Action Plan, which is referenced GT6, land at Brook Farm and Laurel Farm. In the first instance, it's been put to me that this site is subject to a landownership dispute, relating to a key roundabout that's required for access and which is unresolved. What's the partnership's response to that point, please? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We're aware of the issue here and the discussions for a roundabout on Plumstead Road to access the Brook Farm site. My understanding is that there are plans put in place for a temporary solution that would involve the creation of a T-junction that then in time could be upgraded to a roundabout.
So from your perspective, Mr. Banham, has this matter been overcome, or this constraint been overcome through a temporary workaround? Is that your position, if I understand it correctly?
I don't know whether it's been fully overcome, but I believe there is a solution which the council feels can be reached and resolve the issue. We are aware of it, and that did feature in the judgment to put the Brook Farm site slightly later in the housing trajectory.
And so that solution you mentioned, has that been formally proposed and has it been agreed in principle with the Highway Authority?
As far as I know, it hasn't. I believe it's still a work in progress.
So it's being discussed as a potential solution rather than as an agreed solution which has been finalised?
That's my understanding, yes. Although I should stress that the Highways Authority are actively engaged, so we're confident of reaching a resolution.
But that hasn't been reached yet, which implies that the fine detail hasn't been agreed yet, does it not?
Yes, I think that's a correct summary.
And I mean, the next question was in fact in relation to the longer lead-in times, because this site does have a far longer lead-in time to delivery in the trajectory compared to the two previous sites we discussed, and that is to reflect this access issue, is it?
That's correct, sir.
And so the Highway Authority, in principle, of the view that access can be achieved without this disputed land ownership?
I think a solution has to be reached for the development to come forward, and as I stated and you summarised, it's a solution which the Highway Authority believes and the local authority believes can be achieved. Part of the solution involves local authority owned land just to the north as well, so there is a means to help achieve satisfactory highway connections along the Plumstead Road, both into sort of existing and new developments there.
Okay. What's the basis for 73 dwellings per annum on this site? That seems a very precise figure. It's not rounded. It's not rounded, for example.
I was reflecting on that this morning. My recollection of this was it was a figure that was based on delivery rates we've seen elsewhere. So for other developments such as White House Farm, we have seen sort of delivery rates that are slightly above what we would assume from start to finish.
But is this site controlled by a landowner at this stage, a developer at this stage, or is it not? So is that assumed about what's likely to happen rather than based on a known position with regards to an end developer?
It's based on likely position rather than information from a developer or house builder.
Okay. Don't wish to comment on this site. I certainly have representations before me in relation to it from at least one participant today. Halsbury.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Really, just put the hand up to say we don't really have much more to add beyond what's in our matter statement. We identified a trajectory of 40 based upon the local averages, which, as we discussed in previous sessions, is based on a small number of sites. The start to finish average for reference for a site of this sort size would be 68 per annum. So 73 slightly above that, but it does come back to the basic point that we don't at the moment have the evidence before us on the site to support a particular rate of build out. So it might be if the council could come back with some evidence to justify what it's assuming for build out, that would be helpful as justification in the plan. Thank you.
Thank you. So what stage is this site at then? Presumably, is if there's no developer involved, what stage is it at, just for my understanding, Mr. Banham?
I'd say it's a relatively early stage, despite the fact that it's a permission that's been in place for a while. I think there does need to be some further work to bring it forward so that it is a deliverable site. And yeah, for the time being, we felt it was appropriate to place it more cautiously in the trajectory.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any further comments on this site before we move on? Okay. The next site I wanted to discuss from the Growth Triangle Area Action Plan was the Norwich RFU site. I assume that's rugby football. Well, rugby football, you'd expect club. I don't know what the U stands for, but it's associated with the sports team at present. Reference GT13. It's a simple point on this site. It's been put to me that the rugby club can no longer relocate as envisaged because the University of East Anglia have pulled out of those arrangements that would have facilitated their relocation. Does the partnership have a response to that point, please?
That position that you summarised is correct, sir. The local authority, the Broughton District Council, is working with the club to look for alternative sites that may possibly even include relocating somewhere within the Beeston Park development. Obviously, we're mindful of the long-term future of the club and assisting them where possible. In the meantime, though, we are Broughton District Council is progressing CPO work, so that's in regard to continuing the east-west link road.
An east-west link road within the site.
That's yeah, through the site, yes.
So Broadland are pursuing to purchase part of the club's ownership, just the Spine Road or the entire site?
I believe it's the entire site. I do not know for sure though.
Given that the initial plans, at least for relocation, have now fallen through, what does that say about the availability of this site? Is it available, or is it likely to be available at the point envisaged?
I think it's likely to be available. We do obviously need to do work with the club to make sure that their future is secured, as well as bringing forward the development. So there are definitely two strands to the strategy that the council is pursuing in relation to this site.
So from your perspective, even though the relocation has fallen through, you still believe this is a site that should be included in the trajectory?
Yes.
And what are the reasons for that, Mr. Banham?
Because of the work we're doing to assist with the club relocating, and also to secure the land for development, and obviously you'll see from the trajectory that we've placed it cautiously in the trajectory to reflect that.
And that's the reason for it being placed well outside the 5-year period?
Yes.
Okay. Are there any comments on this site and what Mr. Banham's just said? Mr. Tuddenham, your hand was raised first.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Banham suggested that they're looking toward the Beeston site to provide the relocation. If they do that, would it not be the case that the quantity allowed in the Beeston site would have to reduce by whatever could have been put on the rugby club site? In other words, it has no effect whatsoever, just a relocation. Perhaps Mr. Banham can provide an answer to that to you.
In terms of reducing the overall capacity of the Beeston site, is that your concern, Mr. Tuddenham? Sorry,
Sorry, yes, sir. Yes, sir, it is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Banham, just to respond to that point.
I can't provide a definitive answer other than to say that Beeston Park is only one of the possible alternatives for relocating the club. And obviously, Beeston Park is a large, significant site. So any reduction in the net developable area wouldn't necessarily be detrimental to overall housing numbers.
Is it your understanding that the club have to move or wish to move for financial reasons? Is there, you were talking about the long-term survival of the club before. I was just wondering if that was implying a set of circumstances that haven't yet been discussed.
I know that it's been the long-term ambition of the club to relocate. I don't know the financial position well enough of the club to comment on whether they need to relocate and when, but I know that they have promoted or promoted their site for development, and they continue to receive developer interest in the site. And as I said, the council is working with them to identify alternatives to their UEA plans.
And when did those UEA plans fall through?
I don't know, sir. I might just ask if I'll just ask if a colleague happens to know.
Okay, thank you.
No, I'm afraid we don't have a date for when those proposals fell through. We think it was 2 years ago, I'm being told.
Okay.
Sorry, sir.
Mr. Tuddenham, do you wish to come in?
Two years was a long time ago, sir, and one would have thought some actions would have been taken now if the rugby club do indeed want to move. I'd suggest they don't. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tuddenham. Okay, I think that's all I need to hear on the Norwich Rugby Club site. Are there any other comments on any other sites identified in the Growth Triangle Area Action Plan which have not been covered so far? Okay, thank you. In which case, I wanted to move on to discuss the two large sites allocated in the Long Stratton Area Action Plan. Just one point of clarification from my perspective. When the partnership referred to the part of the site with capacity for 600 dwellings, presumably that's the site to the north of the town. Is that correct?
That's correct. I tend to refer to it as the western side, but it is, yes, the northwestern side.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. It's been put to me by a number of participants of the current session, that there have been repeated delays in the delivery of these sites due to problems in securing funding for the bypass. What's the partnership's response to those points, please?
Yeah, I mean, just in summary, sir, South Norfolk Council has 2 applications before it, both dating from 2018. I've spoken to my development management colleagues who say that these 2 applications will be going to committee in spring of this year. One application, which I refer to as sort of the Western site 2018-0112, is 600 homes, of which 213 are in full, and that site will be developed by Norfolk Homes. Their intention is to be on site in 23-24, and if you wish me to continue, so I could briefly update you on the eastern site, if that would be helpful.
Please.
That application, again, is a 2018 application. That's being promoted by Norfolk Land. That site is the larger parcel for 1,275 homes. The intention of the promoter there is to market the site to other national and regional house builders, and for that to be progressed as a sort of multiple outlet site, hence the higher rate of delivery in our housing trajectory. And if you don't mind me continuing, sir,
No,
with regard to the bypass, £26 million of funding has been secured from government for its construction, and the partnership has resolved to approve £6.7 million worth of SIL supported borrowing to help the delivery of the bypass, with the new road expected to be open before the end of 2024. So in summary, there's a considerable amount of progress that's now taking place with the site.
Okay, and that's the official timing that's been produced by the body that will construct the road, presumably?
Yeah, that's the information I've heard through my county council highways colleagues.
Okay. Does anyone wish to comment on what Mr. Bannon has just said and the update he's provided with regards to the provision of the bypass and with regards to the progress of those applications? Mr. Jones, your hand's raised.
Thank you, sir. I think the first point is that we obviously set out in our hearing statement an updated trajectory for the site. I think Mr. Banham has just agreed that we're at least a year behind in terms of lead-in times. If they're going to be on site in 2023, 24, they're certainly not going to be delivering any houses that year, and so it will commence, I would expect, the year after that, which is as we set out. I wasn't aware that Norfolk Land were going to be selling the site to the east. I haven't seen any statement from them saying as such. You'll be aware, sir, that Norfolk Land and Norfolk Homes are one and the same. And while it is listed as two separate sites because it's two separate applications, it is one allocation currently being brought forward essentially by the same company. I don't believe it can therefore be considered as two sites in terms of build out and delivery rates. The council have currently forecast 150 dwellings per annum from 2029 on the eastern site and 40 dwellings per annum on the western site. So 190 dwellings per annum all told. Start to finish, I believe, says 120 dwellings per annum average on sites of this size, of 1,800 dwellings, that is. And I believe Mr. Spry, in his evidence to Matter 2, did a further analysis of sites in Greater Norfolk or Greater Norwich and sort of confirmed that on average they deliver 80 dwellings per annum on sites of this size. So I think it's probably a little bit over optimistic in terms of delivery assumptions. Obviously, that I was assuming that was based on one house builder. If that's not the case, then you can be a bit more ambitious. The other issue here is, well, there's issues with the applications for a start in terms of when they will go to committee. There's still outstanding objections on ecology, highways, and viability considerations. The applicants submitted a viability statement to say they can only viably deliver 10% affordable housing. That's because of the cost of delivering the bypass. I forget the exact figure, but I think they're being asked for 6 or 9 million there or thereabouts. So those matters still need to be resolved. I don't believe there's been a district values report on the viability of the site yet. So I'd question whether spring committee is achievable. But in terms of delivery rates, obviously, if there is a very low level of affordable housing being delivered, that will impact on delivery rates as well. Affordable housing tends to be delivered faster than market housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mr. Banham, Mr. Jones has taken from what you've said that you agree that delivery on the smaller site will need to be pushed back a year. Is that your position? Based on the current trajectory, which shows delivery of 30 dwellings in 23-24, which is in effect assuming that sites will begin to be built out and deliver units roughly just over a year from now.
I recently spoke to the agent around this site who was optimistic about being on site in accordance with the trajectory. So at the moment, the trajectory, as I understand it, is based on what the promoter is looking to achieve. I do appreciate that time is moving on and that position may have changed, but at the moment, I'm not aware of a particular problem with the trajectory.
Well, 600, the smaller site is 600 homes, doesn't yet benefit from full consent. And in order to assume 30 dwellings in 23-24, which is the same number of dwellings that are assumed in subsequent years, so it in effect assumes a full financial year of completions, then you are really assuming that a start on site will take place less than a year from now to facilitate completions coming forward early in the financial year 23-24. Obviously, the site doesn't yet have full permission, and presumably on a site of that size, there will be upfront infrastructural works and conditions to discharge. But I think that's the point that was being made, and it does look ambitious unless you can explain how those milestones would be hit within that sort of timescale.
No, I do take the point. So I think this is a site that I'd like to look again at when we do the updated trajectory for you later in spring.
Okay, well, you've heard my concerns, particularly on the smaller site coming forward as early as is forecast. Like I say, it's been put to you by a couple of participants that should be at least a year back. The other point is about assuming 150 on the largest site. What's that based on?
As I hinted at, the idea here is that the largest site wouldn't be built out by Norfolk Homes, but would be promoted by Norfolk Land, who would bring in probably other national house builders to deliver the site, and then, as per some of the other conversations we've had this afternoon, we'd expect this site to then be building out with 2 or possibly 3 different outlets simultaneously, and hence achieve the higher rate of 150 per annum.
And how you say that's your understanding? How far down the line are the current landholders in pursuing that approach, and how certain is it that other house builders will be brought in on that basis?
What I just related to you was the position of the agent. I don't know whether the conversation or the work done by the agent has moved to that level that you suggested, sir.
Okay. Are there any further comments on the Long Stratton sites? Okay. Obviously, we've covered quite a lot of sites in both the Growth Triangle Area Action Plan and the Long Stratton Area Action Plan. Are there any other comments on sites allocated in other plans that we haven't covered yet? Mr. Tierney.
So Richard Tierney, Welbeck. I just wanted to mention the Wyndham Area Action Plan sites. Those have progressed to the stage of permissions being obtained and in some instances built out. But as we set out in our hearing statement on this matter, the numbers which are being delivered are less than those that are assumed in the plan. And I think it comes back to a point we've already touched on at the start of this hearing session on the absence of an up-to-date AMR. And hopefully when the council updates their trajectory to reflect a new base date, they'll be able to provide that information so that we can be clear as to what these sites are delivering. But as we set out in our hearing statement, the 3 allocations appear to be delivering fewer houses than are assumed in the plan. Obviously, they are in delivery or close to delivery. One of the allocations is not progressing as far as we can see, and has been assumed to progress in this plan.
Thank you, Mr. Tierney. Is it your view that one of those allocations should be considered to deliver beyond the current plan period?
No, that's not our case. The case is in fact the other way around, that the Wyndham allocations burn out in the next few years, but they do so without providing the quantum that is envisaged in this plan and that was envisaged at the point of their allocation under the AAP a few years ago. But our broader point about Wyndham is not that those allocations are going to deliver after 2038. It's that what is left of them will all be on the current trajectory, all assumed to come forward by 2029, and then there won't be new housing in Wyndham for the last 9 or 10 years of the plan period.
Okay, thank you. Does the partnership wish to respond to that point before we move on?
I think, as we've previously set out, sir, we feel that the plan provides sufficient growth across the plan area and does not require all settlements to grow all of the time.
Okay. And there's been a full discussion of that particular matter before, so I don't propose to revisit it in detail. Okay. From my perspective, that's question 5 covered now in terms of the commitments. Question 6 is, can the market absorb the number of additional homes envisaged in and around Norwich city centre? Is this supported by demonstrable evidence? There is a significant degree of overlap here with a question I asked under matter 3, was question 1. And again, that's asked about the deliverability of the strategy for Norwich in the city centre. And certainly there were a large number of contributions made in that session on this particular point. There is a degree of overlap between the 2 points. And I've asked all my questions at that session that I wish to ask. But if others wish to come in who weren't at that session or who were at that session and wish to add a point that they didn't make at that time, I'm happy to hear any points on question 6. Thank you. Okay. We'll move on to question 7 then, which is the windfall allowance. Question for the partnership to start. As I understand it, the windfall allowance is based on an assessment of historic completions on schemes of 9 units or less in Broadland and South Norfolk, but on all sites, regardless of size, in Norwich. Is that correct? And if so, why has an inconsistent approach been adopted to identifying historic windfalls across the 3 partner authorities? Thank you.
Yes, so I'll just introduce this by saying that the our response is set out in the response to your initial questions, which is document D 1.4a. That's our overall position. And of course, the approach was agreed at the Beckett's Grove appeal as part of the 5-year land supply, and you can find that at paragraph 76 of D 1.4b. So the approach that you just asked for an explanation on has been accepted at an appeal. It's based on the different characteristics of 2 largely rural districts with significant suburbs and a wholly urban district, the Norwich City. Within Norwich City, windfall development happens on all sorts of sites, and clearly in recent years quite a lot of that's happened as PD development, and given the relaxation of PD rights, we can assume that will continue strongly within the city into the future, whereas in the rural districts, the bigger sites perhaps tend more to come forward as sites won on appeal, quite often because of a 5-year land supply issue. And so we would, from the plan making perspective, we would expect to be demonstrating a 5-year land supply. And so we would have less of those sites coming forward in the rural area, less of those larger sites. So essentially what we've taken is a cautious approach in the 2 more rural districts, and a realistic approach They're both. I don't want to undermine myself. They're all realistic, but an approach in the city that takes account of the nature of an urban area.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Morris. I think there's two follow-on questions I'd like to ask based on what you've said. I think the first is kind of proceed. Well, it's the issue with including every single site for Norwich is that inevitably that will capture occasionally quite large sites. I've come across windfalls in the past that have been up to 400 dwellings, for example. It might not be the case that there's windfalls of that scale here, but all it takes is for one or two very large sites to come forward to potentially skew the overall average over a longer period. So to what extent does the approach taken in Norwich guard against or open up that possibility?
Well, the overall approach reduces the historic rates by 33%. So all forms of potential by reducing by 33%, it smooths out these potential issues where there may be some sort of lumpy development. It also looks back over 10 years, and so it gives a long enough time scale to be typical. As I say, with the PD rights issue, it's likely that more development will be achieved rather than less, and indeed perhaps more large sites might come forward through office conversion or other conversion. So I don't think I see any likely distortion of the figures through large sites that have happened. I can't actually put my finger on any which are particularly large that might distort them.
Okay. The second question, follow-up question I wanted to ask, if we can just draw your attention to table 6 in the part 1 plan, which has been discussed already, which is the very helpful summary of the requirement and then the various components of the supply. So obviously row F is the windfall allowance, and that gives the number you're assuming. It says then in the explanation that there is a limited reliance on windfall sites. Evidence provides an estimated 4,500 homes resulting from windfall development during the remainder of the plan period. So presumably, as I take it, when you did the initial trend-based approach, before you sifted out sites of more than 9 dwellings in Broadland and South Norfolk, and before you applied the 33% discount, that was the total gross figure of unanticipated windfalls provided in the 10 years. Is that?
No, so that's not correct. No, the 4,000 plus figure is taking account of past rates of, as you say, developments of 9 dwellings or fewer within the 2 districts and all development within the city, then discounting by 33%. And that gives you the 4,000. In our response to your question, that figure is a slight overestimate. I think the actual figure is 4,411 because it was based on some previous some early work on this. So the 4,400 and odd is already a discounted figure.
And what's discounted from the 4,400 figure? Just so I'm clear.
Well, then we've taken 30% of that to put into table 6.
There's 2 steps I'm trying to understand here. So one is the entirety of the windfalls over a 10-year period, and then you're saying that the figure of 4,450 is itself discounted. So you've got the total gross amount. What process leads from the total gross amount to 4,450? What deductions are made?
Sorry, so I'm going to have to go back to have a look at these notes again. We've gone back over 10 years. We've looked at the rates of development. We've taken out sites in the rural area over 10 and over dwellings, and then that is discounted by 33% for the housing land supply to give us 276 dwellings per year.
And then what I'm struggling with a little bit, and it might be that I've missed it in the evidence, in which case I'm happy for you to draw my attention to the relevant section of the document in question. It's not clear how the figure of 4,450 has been boiled down to 1,296. I mean, it struck me that from what you'd said, and I was just trying to clarify it in my own mind, really, perhaps I'd originally anticipated that 4,450 was the total gross figure, including sites lost at appeal, say on 5-year supply grounds, including sites of above 9 dwellings and prior to the application of a 33% discount. So I thought that 4,450 was the gross figure, and then 1,296 was a net figure subsequent to all of those adjustments and alterations. If that's not the case, then just please direct me to the relevant section of the evidence where it's set out. Or
I think it's set out in our response to your initial questions, and paragraphs 67 to 70. So in paragraph 68, we take the 10-year period. That gives us 414 dwellings. To make sure there's no overcounting, that's then reduced by 33% to 276 dwellings per year. And then we, in 69, we provide a ratchet up from year 0 or year 1 of 0 through years 2 and 3. That gives a total of 4,411 over the period 2020 to 2038. So that is the gross figure, but it already includes some discounting. And then we apply that to the plan by a further reduction by only taking 30% of that allowance and adding it into table 6.
What's the reason for the 30% being taken forward?
It was just to it's just a figure that applies more caution to this process, because we didn't want to be too reliant on windfall development. So there's no particular science to it. It's roughly a third, slightly less than a third of the allowance.
So the 4,450 doesn't include, for example, sites lost at appeal on 5-year supply grounds?
No, not in Broadland, South Norfolk.
Okay, that's helpful clarification. Thank you. Mr. Neil, you've got your hand raised.
I'm grateful, sir. The CPRE is concerned not so much whether there's compelling evidence that the proposed allowance of 1,296 will provide reliable source of supply, but frankly, that figure of 1,296 is plainly way too cautious, and that relates directly to some of the questions you've just raised, sir. I mean, just to set this in context, what we're really dealing with here is we have a situation of a buffer of 22%, and really that higher windfall allowance should be included in the plan and result in a reduction in the overall amount of housing being allocated. But that's perhaps a separate point. When we're actually looking at the individual figures, I'd ask you, sir, to look very carefully at what we've said in the third paragraph of our position statement, where, and this ties in with the document that Mr. Morris has just referred to you. If you actually look at the document relied on in that response at paragraph 67 to your initial question, sir, the windfall assessment summary, and that is actually, just to be clear what that document is, it's the annual monitoring report of 2019 to 2020, and buried away in the appendix there you can see the windfall assessment summary for the current joint course strategy. And what you can actually see if you do the maths on the table is that you're looking at an average of 344 windfalls per year for South Norfolk, Broadland and Norwich, and you can top those up. And just to set this in context, that is effectively way in excess of the approximately 100 units per annum windfalls which have been included in this plan. So, the answer we've heard from Mr. Morris, which is, what's the basis for this 33% reduction, feeds into that. That it's not just an overly cautious approach that's been adopted here. It's one that is inexplicably cautious and massive, and that's also in the context of that 33% being really just a figure plucked from thin air without any proper evidential basis. And all of this is extremely concerning because you've already referred, sir, to that 4,450 figure. We now hear that in itself isn't the gross figure, that was somewhat higher. Yet we've only got 1,296 being included in the plan as a windfall allowance. And we say that just simply isn't justified. And it should be significantly higher. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Do you wish to respond to anything that's been said, Mr. Morris?
Only to come back to a point I made under a different matter, that the intention of the authorities is to ensure that we provide for housing need and the housing requirement, and we wanted to make sure there was sufficient flexibility in the plan to do that. If any of our other sites started to slow down or would slow down in their achievement of growth. So one of the aspects of that we discussed earlier was a contingency site. Another aspect of it is not taking account of the full windfall allowance that we may have otherwise included. And clearly, I'm hoping it gives some comfort to those people who are concerned about our supply, that there is this extra windfall allowance that is likely to happen and will help us deliver on need. Of course, windfall only happens as extra growth if there's a demand for the total scale of growth. Otherwise, it will simply substitute for other commitments.
Okay. One brief further question for myself before I'll go to Mr. Tierney, who I see has got his hand raised. So as I understand it, in getting to the gross figure, which is then a 30% assumption is made on the gross figure, there's a 33% discount, which is that just for a lapse rate, or is that for something more than just a lapse rate? Because obviously a certain proportion of
it's based partly on lapse. It's based partly on lapse rates. So yeah.
But in Appendix D2 of the 2019-20 AMR, the lapse rate across the three authorities appears to be closer to 20%. So I was just wondering where the figure of 33% had come from, and if it was based on something other than just the lapse rate.
Just caution, sir.
Okay. Mr. Tierney, did you wish to come in?
Thank you, sir. Richard Tierney for Welbeck. The point we made is going in the opposite direction from Mr. Neal's point, but we think there's a risk with the windfall allowance that there's an element of double counting, because there are two policies in the plan which are innovative in the sense that they're not a normal approach to plan making. That's 7.4 and 7.5. Small scale allocations through the village cluster, South Norfolk Village Cluster plan, and the limitation on windfall delivery in parishes. Those two things, we say, potentially overlap with what historically would have come forward as windfall. So small sites being allocated in villages often would have been windfall rather than plan-led. And in terms of policy 7.5, obviously it's a bar on windfall delivery. It limits the number of units that can be delivered within any particular parish as windfall. And in any event, the numbers for those parishes are accounted for in a separate line in Table 6. So we say it's more a problem of double counting rather than undercounting for the windfall allowance.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tierney. I mean, that's helpful in the sense that I was aiming to move on to the other side of the argument, so to speak. We've heard one side of the coin from Mr. Neal, and and from others in the written submissions, I'm aware that there's an argument that pushes in the other direction. With regards to policy 7.5 and 7.4, I mean, obviously in table 6 there's a separate line itemised for homes delivered through policy 7.5. There isn't a separate line allocated for applications that come through under policy 7.4. But as I understand from what you just said, Mr. Turney, the concern there is that whereas there are allocated sites in the village clusters now, presumably is that a reversal of the position that's been allowed in the past? Is that the point that's being made with regards to a double counting purely in relation to policy 7.4? Thank you.
So if it helps, as I understand it, the 1200 figure, which is to be dealt with through the South Norfolk Village Clusters plan, is counted in the 10,700 figure in the previous line because it's counted as an allocation in this plan. So it's not ignored. The point is really that type of development, which is anticipated to be small scale allocations on the edge of villages, historically would have come forward as windfall. And therefore, when you're looking at historic windfall delivery, you're now looking at a rather different proposition because it said that should be dealt with through allocation.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hook, did you have a comment to make?
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Yes, I think the idea of double counting is misunderstanding 7.4 and 7.5. Windfalls are essentially, and I'm speaking with a CPRE hat on and a chairman of parish council hat on, in representing a village which has had windfalls. Windfalls happen within what was called the development boundary, the settlement limit. 7.4 and 7.5 will be outside the settlement boundary. I think that will be additional to windfalls, and I also think that the village cluster plan will lead to allocated sites that are sites outside current development boundary limits and therefore will not conflict with windfall development. So I don't think there is an element of double counting. I think that windfalls will continue as they have done, and knowing all the villages around here, they've been quite productive, and I can't see that any of looking at all the sites that have been put forward in the village clusters plan, I can't see how any of those would restrict the flow of windfalls, and I can't see how 7.5 would restrict the flow of windfalls, and that's speaking with a lot of local knowledge, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hook. Mr. Morris, did you want to comment on those points of view with regards to the potential double counting through 7.4 in the first instance? Thank you.
Well, I absolutely agree with Mr. Hook's explanation. So he can do my job on this one. The allocations that are being made through this plan in Broadland, in the village clusters, and the allocations that are being made through the South Norfolk Village Cluster plan are, as far as I'm aware, entirely outside of village development boundaries. There may be the odd exception, but they tend to, a new allocation tends to be on outside of a development boundary, simply because of the nature of development boundaries. They don't leave sufficient scale within them for the size of allocations that we are making. They tend to be, plots for 1 or 2, and therefore windfall, rather than sites for our starting point was a minimum 12. I think most of our sites are 15, 20 dwellings. Those sites don't occur inside development boundaries unless you get a windfall brownfield development coming forward. So 7.4 allocations, I can't see there's any significant double counting at all. 7.5 is
sorry to interrupt. So we'll leave 7.5 for now, because I think 7.4 is the one I'm just wanting to get my head around in the first instance. I went through the majority of certainly a high proportion of the smaller allocations in village clusters in sessions this week and last. It was my experience that most of them were outside of the settlement boundaries, if not all of them. So is it the position of yourself and Mr. Hook that the previous policy context restricted development outside of those settlement boundaries, and therefore in the trend period upon which windfalls are based, there wouldn't be unexpected sites coming forward outside of the development boundaries unless they were lost on appeal, for example, where there's a lack of a 5-year supply. And from what I understood before, you've in any case wheedled those out prior to reaching the figure of 4,450. Is that the correct position?
That's exactly the position, sir, yes.
Okay. Do I wish to comment on that point before I go on to 7.5? Okay. With regards to 7.5, we did briefly discuss this when we went through that policy in the first 2 weeks. And obviously I've asked the partnership to reconsider policy 7.5, and depending on the route that's taken in reconsidering that policy, it may affect the number of dwellings that it's reasonable to assume. I understand the basis upon which 800 has been derived. That was explained in the session where we discovered policy, where we discussed, I should say, policy 7.5. But notwithstanding that revisitation, which will take place separately, it's been alleged again by a couple of parties that there is a double counting in effect with regards to the assumed delivery under policy 7.5 and the assumed windfall allowance. The point that's been raised by Mr. Hook, in which you elaborated upon, relating principally to the distinction between sites inside and outside of a settlement boundary. Again, does that distinction apply to homes assumed to be delivered under policy 7.5?
Yes, sir. Policy 7.5 is entirely about delivering very small sites outside of development boundaries, on the edge of development boundaries of villages, or in groups of dwellings which don't indeed benefit from settlement boundaries. So sometimes those kind of sites, and your experience will probably you'll probably have experience of this. Occasionally, you do get a windfall development of a single house or 2 houses outside of a development boundary, but they're pretty rare, and the kind of circumstances where they might apply would still apply under these policies. The difference is this policy is actually promoting very small scale development on the edge of villages or within groups of dwellings. So again, there may be some minor double counting, but generally speaking, this is a policy opening up almost completely new opportunity.
Okay, thank you.
Just to say, sir, clearly I mean, you've alluded to this. Clearly, when we've come up with a alternative approach to this policy, which we are doing because of concerns about the way it would operate, then we'll have to recalculate what that figure might be.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Morris. Are there any further comments on any potential double counting in relation to the windfall allowance and policy 7.5? Okay, I think that concludes the questions I wanted to put to the partnership about the windfall allowance. Are there any other questions or points that I've not covered that anyone would like to put forward? Mr. Neal.
Thank you, sir. But there is just one perhaps more minor point, and it may be just a point of clarification, but the partnership would have seen our hearing statement, again, the third paragraph in response to question 7, where what we don't understand, and it may be a simple explanation, is why is there a figure of 0 windfalls given in the housing trajectory between the years 2018 to 2020, 2024. We just simply don't understand that, and that's the point. It's referenced on page 22 of the topic paper 1. I think that's core document 3.1. But it may be that there's an explanation for that, and maybe it's wrapped up in the maths. But I'd just let Mr. was wondering if Mrs. Morris could explain that, if he's had a chance to see our position statement.
Mr. Morris, do you wish to respond?
Well, yes, sir. When you're doing a trajectory for windfall development, then in sort of years 1, 2, and 3, it will be affected by permissions that are already counted in your commitment, because clearly it can't take place without a permission. But because permissions normally last 3 years, then after that, then anything developed after that will be a new windfall development. But anything that happens within years 1, 2, and 3 needs to have a sort of ratchet approach applied to it to make sure you're not double counting with your existing commitment figure. So in the first year it's 0, because it's very likely that any windfall development that takes place in years 1 will have had permission within your commitment, which is the starting point. So what we're talking about with the windfall allowance is future windfalls, not past windfalls.
And all of the past windfalls are in effect wrapped up in the commitments tab.
Yes,
there.
There will be existing
permissions, known permissions that have been counted as sites with planning permission, small sites with planning permission, etc.
They will either have permission or they will have been developed.
Okay, so there's no loss to the supply. It's merely a categorization of those sites.
Yes, and an avoidance of double counting.
Okay, and the approach to the first 2 or 3 years is that ratcheting approach.
Yes.
So windfall site in year 1 would potentially need to gain permission, and then it would be delivering beyond that in a phased manner up to the level at which you'd assume following that.
Yes, sir. A permission in year -1 or year 0 would not be counted in the windfall allowance because it's within your commitment. A permission granted in year 1, would not be developed out until year 2 or year 3, or even year 4. So that's the reason for the ratcheting up. It's about future windfall development rather than windfall development that's already within your commitment.
Okay, thank you. That's a helpful clarification. Are there any further comments on windfalls before we move on? Okay, in which case I'll pass back to Mr. Warden to cover questions 8 onwards. Thank you for your contributions on that matter.
Thank you, Mr. Hatfield. Can everyone hear me? Mr. Banham, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to deal with questions. I've dealt with question 10, so I'm going to deal with questions 8 and 9, and I'm going to do them in reverse order. I'm going to start with question 9. And the partnership has updated also in respect of DIS to say that the steering group preparing the DIS neighbourhood plan has announced that it will be undertaking further Regulation 14 consultation that is due to start in March. The website I see has been updated as of yesterday, I believe, to state that will be taking place very soon. I don't have any questions for the partnership in respect of the DIS area neighbourhood plan in terms of this question. I just want to know whether there is any points that any other participants wish to make at this stage. Mr. Dixon, we're zooming in on you.
Thank you, sir. I was attempting to raise my hand, but that wasn't working, so I turned my camera on instead. So thank you for that. It's a very quick point, sir. As we've raised at various points, whilst the group is progressing a neighbourhood plan, we don't really have any clear evidence, given the discussions we've just been having about housing numbers, that there are sites in DIS that will deliver the number of homes that the neighbourhood plan is being asked to deliver.
Thank you. Mr. Scott. Thank you, Mr. Dixon. Down as Mr. Scott. Yes, please.
Thank you, sir. It was just to clarify, we've got one of the sites that is a draft allocation within the neighbourhood plan. We've actually submitted an application for 179 dwellings. We've also got a developer on board with this site. So actually, in terms of trajectory, we're going to be probably projecting we'll be 3 years ahead of the numbers provided by the partnership.
And which site is this, Mr. Scott?
Sorry, it's the land to east of Shelfhanger Road. So we've got an application in, which is referenced 2021-2782 for 179 dwellings. And we're looking for delivery commencing in 24-25.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I think that the second of my points may have been answered, because one of our queries, as you'll see from our comments, was that within the district neighbourhood plan, whilst there's a total of 400 dwellings, or in excess of 400 dwellings proposed, 200 of those were on one site, and I'm guessing that those 200 may have been the site that Mr. Scott is now referring to. The other point was purely, I think, as the previous respondent made, that at the moment the timescales for this plan are still somewhat uncertain, and hence that needs to be borne in mind in terms of reliance on the figures that are being proposed here.
Thank you. Mr. Scott, do you want to come back to Mr. Smith's point?
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Smith, you're right. Our site it was an allocation of 200. We reduced it down to 179 following the public consultation. Obviously, we submitted it in December. We've already had quite a lot of consultee responses, including support from the town council. So, we're optimistic that we can achieve the numbers that we're projecting.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. Banham, is there anything you'd like to say in response?
No, nothing further to add, sir.
Mr. Scott, your hand's still up. Is that from before? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can I move to South Norfolk? And we have, in respect to the village clusters plan, we have had quite a bit of discussion in previous sessions about the South Norfolk village clusters plan. So I'd just like to understand so we've already discussed whether the 1,200 should be a minimum, and the partnership has indicated that it would be content with a modification which should change the word minimum to the region of, or approximately. We've already discussed the spatial distribution within the plan and the growth strategy session, so I don't intend to revisit that. Mr. Dixon, in respect of your representations, are you able just to explain to me what it is you are seeking in order to make the plan sound? I wasn't entirely clear from your representations. I wonder if you could help me, please.
Thank you, sir. What we were seeking was essentially some surety that the South Norfolk Village Clusters plan can deliver that 1,200 homes. As you know, sir, it's slightly strange that we have a situation where we have a plan for a combined area where a part of that plan has been carved out and is being addressed in another plan. And on the one hand, whilst national policy supports identifying housing numbers for areas that can then be addressed in neighbour plans, 1,200 is a very sizable figure. And were that plan to only be able to deliver, say, or identify suitable sites for 1,000 homes, then we would have 200 short. So the village clusters plan is essentially kicking that part of the process out of this process that you're examining and down the road a little bit, and asking you to have faith and confidence that they will be able to deliver 1,200. And what we've seen to date is lots of assurances and requests for confidence in the same way that we're asked for those in relation to individual sites. And as you've experienced over the last couple of weeks or so, even where we've got a lot more detailed information in relation to those individual sites, then when you actually dig into that, you raise questions about whether what is said will be delivered will actually be delivered. So at the moment, what we're suggesting is that there is a insufficient wealth of evidence to have any confidence that 1,200 homes will be delivered through that village clusters plan. Some homes will be, but we don't have the confidence regarding the number. And so in relation to what we're asking for, it's essentially the same as what you've asked for on some individual sites, which is additional information. And that additional information might give us the confidence, it might show us that actually the figure needs to be changed. I hope that helps, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Dixon. Mr. Neil?
Thank you, sir. I mean, just to chime with the point that Mr. Dixon's made in terms of confidence in the South Norfolk Village Clusters Plan, the CPRE does have some confidence that that will, as to what will actually happen with that plan. We're here in March now. The daffodils are appearing. It's springtime, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, looking out of the window, yet we still don't know. From what I understand, my instructions are that the Reg 19 submission has not yet commenced, and the concerns we voiced a few weeks ago are only increasing in terms of the danger of that plan being bogged down and not delivering what it is assumed it will deliver. So just to emphasise, the CPRE's position is that there is justification to pause what's going on at the moment and wait for and see what's going on with the South Norfolk Village Cluster Plan, because of the uncertainties and as you said, in terms of what Mr. Dixon said, the slightly unusual approach of carving out quite a significant allocation to a different plan. But you have our points under question 8, sir, and that's just to really emphasise what Mr. Dixon's been saying. Thank you.
Thank you. I do, Mr. Neil. So your position is that you think the examination of this plan should wait for the South Norfolk plan to catch up.
Indeed, and that's what we've said in our position statement, because until you actually have some certainty about where that plan's got to, it's not even at Reg 19 submission stage, you're not going to be able to assume anything in terms of the certainty of those 1,200 units coming forward.
Thank you. Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, sir. Just to very briefly introduce myself, Nicole Wright should have been speaking at the moment, but unfortunately he's caught COVID, so he's unwell to speak, so I've had to rush in and fill in on her behalf. In terms of who we're representing, it's Miss Kate Jackson, the Heartland Pact, the Chapel Farm Partnership, Shottersham Park Estate, and the trustees of the Richard Gurney's Children's Settlement, so not many. In terms of the actual point that I'd like to make, sort of thing, and it's picking up on this issue regarding in the event of if there's a delay in the adoption of the clusters plan, policy 7.4 should provide some form of strategic framework under which applications for schemes and village clusters can be assessed in the hopefully interim period until the cluster plan is actually adopted, but could also facilitate growth if this cluster plan does not materialise for some reason further down the line. Particularly of point sort of thing, in the light of some of the unavoidable delays in terms of the preparation of neighbourhood plans within the South Norfolk Village cluster areas, such as with Dickleborough, and the potential for delays in the adoption of the separate village clusters housing allocation plan, there is a lack of confidence in achieving that minimum or in the roundabout number of 1,200 homes to be delivered. And basically it should be considered that the introduction of an interim policy or a change of wording to the village clusters to enable larger sites to come forward would actually be a way to sort of mitigate those concerns. Particularly at the moment, policy 7.4 is too restrictive in terms of only allowing up to 15 dwellings. And that, I'd argue, is not in conflict directly with paragraph 78 and 79 of the NPPF. So to make the plan sound, I'd like to argue that actually it's considered the wording up to a maximum of 15 dwellings should be removed from under point 2 to facilitate the delivery of more and larger sites, and to actually allow those for in the neighbourhood plans of the various villages within South Norfolk to deliver the larger sites without having that inherent policy conflict between policy 7.4 and any potential site allocations in neighbourhood plans. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Banham, would you like to respond, please? And please also, can you let me know what the partnership's view is? Should the South Norfolk cluster plan not find land for 1,200 homes, could you tell me what is the position? You know, how the partnerships see things being taken forward, and how does, I will talk about monitoring tomorrow, but then how does the partnership expect to be able to monitor progress in respect of the making of that plan and then the bringing forward of sites within that plan?
Well, the current position, as you know, sir, is that the village clusters plan is progressing well. It had its Reg 19 consultation last year, and we're progressing to Reg 19. My understanding from speaking to colleagues who are working on that plan is that they're confident to be able to hit the 1,200 figure. We haven't sort of gone into the what if scenarios of the plan not happening, because we're confident that it will.
Holsbury, please.
Thank you, sir. Can you hear us?
I can hear you, yes. Thank you, Ms. Pugh.
Yes, I mean, it's a point that we raised, I think, in the early stages, but I think our concern really stems from the fact that the village clusters are sort of set within the new allocations row of Table 6. So they're essentially being counted as allocations in this plan, but with no evidence whatsoever that they exist or will be able to be confirmed through any assessment of evidence has been delivered in their entirety. So I think our concern really stems also from the fact that there's 1,200 on top of quite a number of other windfall and small site allocations, which have not been identified in terms of site boundaries, deliverability statements, statements of common ground. And so it's not just the fact that it's just the village clusters that have not been identified. There are a number of other elements of policy making here in terms of positive plan making, which are being effectively left for another day to come forward in an ad hoc manner. We've got concerns about that in terms of infrastructure delivery across the plan and the cumulative effect of that in a plan, a local plan, which is not being positively prepared. We've sort of sat through the part 1 and part 2 hearings on this, and we've heard really a lack of evidence on a number of sites that are allocated, which has led us to question and to adjust trajectories and capacities of sites. So I'm afraid we don't have much confidence that the village clusters sites will be any different, and that in our terms is starting to hint at an unacceptable degree of risk for the effective delivery of this plan. Thank you, sir.
You're on mute, sir.
So sorry, Mr. Cohen.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to pick up very briefly on it in response to Mr. Banham's comments, which sort of is, and again, it picks on that degree of risk as just mentioned sort of thing. In the eventuality that you don't end up with the two plans being adopted simultaneously, you're going to end up with a grace period with the GNLP adopted and the South Norfolk village clusters being somewhere along the line, but not ready to actually be implemented. And the issue there is that will that impede the delivery of that potential 1,200 units or around those 1,200 units? And you're going to end up with situations whereby if you have a period of a couple of years where the other plan is not adopted, or even the period of a year, schemes of 15 dwellings, it's not financially viable in most cases in villages to deliver that, because you do have other associated costs with delivering rural housing schemes. And actually, in this case, you need that sort of flexibility within the policy and the framework to facilitate those sort of larger rural schemes coming forward, because some of the villages within South Norfolk area, they can take much more than 15 dwellings, and it would still be considered small scale in comparison to the quantum of development already existing. I think this all links into that degree of risk with the actual policy and the plan, and not really having that preparation in terms of what if scenarios that the village cluster scheme doesn't come forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cohen. Mr. Hook.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, just to clarify the CPRE Norfolk position on this, in criticising the lack of alignment between the two plans as they develop, we are not speaking in favour of the 1,200 houses being developed in village clusters. And I would just like to say that the numbers that will come forward will definitely be 1,200. I have every confidence in, that the sites that will be put forward in the village cluster plan for development will be cherry picked by the developers. I have no doubt whatsoever that if they are allocated, they will be built. So any reticence from developers that this is not going to happen, I think, is cloud cuckoo land. And again, I speak with a chairman of parish council hat on. I know what happens when a site is released in a village. And if it's 15 houses, it will be leapt upon. If it's 10 houses, it will be leapt upon. There is no doubt that it will be delivered. But from a CPRE point of view, we think it's unnecessary to have the 1,200 houses because the development in villages is already considerable. There are 2,538 existing commitments in village clusters, in 1,146 in Broadland, 1,392 in South Norfolk. There are, if 7.5 gets the go ahead, there'll be another 800 houses there. There are also huge developments occurring not in villages, but alongside villages, which will impact villages and have a significant impact, significant effect on those villages. We talked about Long Stratton a little while ago. The development to the east of Long Stratton, 1,200, 1,300 houses, will have a very big impact on rural hamlets, Fritton, Morningthorpe, Stratton Wood Green, Stratton St Michael. And I don't think villages are going to be starved of development if the village cluster proposals don't go ahead. There is plenty of housing going into villages already. So just wanted to make that point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hook. We have discussed the growth strategy and the pattern of distribution of growth, the proposed distribution of growth within the plan earlier. The question here is about whether there will be 1,200 homes identified and come forward within the South Norfolk plan. I'm going to turn to Mr. Banham now and ask Mr. Banham if he wishes to respond to the points that have been made, please.
I think in terms of numbers, we are confident in being able to hit the 1,200 figure through the work that's been done at Regulation 18 and through the work that's being done now to prepare for Regulation 19. And I suppose my last point is simply to say that preparation of the village clusters plan is a high priority for South Norfolk Council. It's being done to promote sustainable development in rural areas and will obviously assist in bringing a diversity of housing sites to the market.
Thank you. I'm going to bring this discussion to a close now, but I'm grateful for comments that people have made. I've got those comments in writing, and I'm grateful for those clarification and elaboration of them from the participants. It is now 5:10, and I'm very grateful for everyone for bearing with us on this session. It's been another long day, and would like to Mr. Chung of Holsbury.
Yes, thank you, sir. I don't want to delay you unnecessarily. I know you want to bring the session to an end. I think today is the last sort of day where we take an active part in these hearings. I think we're just going to be watching tomorrow, and but not actually taking part. So I was just wondering what the plan of action is moving forward for questions 2 and 4 of matter 15, and the new evidence that the partnership is going to bring forward, both in respect of the East Norwich Tree regeneration area and then specifically to do with housing trajectories, questions 2 and 4. Do we proceed upon safely so on the assumption that the partnership will submit written evidence and participants such as us will have the opportunity to respond in writing to the new evidence submitted, and then that evidence and those hearing statements will be subject to further oral examination hearings? Is that what we're proposing, or
We will.
are those decisions
Yeah,
yet to be made, sir?
we will come. We will once we have an indication from Mr. Bull when we might get the East Norwich information. We will need to arrange a hearing session down the line in order to deal with the questions that we've not yet dealt with, and it is likely that we will relate that to the updated information from the 1st of April 2022.
Thank you, sir. So will it be a process whereby the partnership puts things in writing in terms of the new evidence, new information, whatever impact that has on their position in respect to various matters, that they will put that in writing, and that participants such as us will get the opportunity to respond in writing prior to any hearing sessions?
Yes, because the hearing sessions, we've not yet had a hearing session. What we wanted to do is pick up the overall land supply discussion and the 5-year land supply discussion in the light of having discussed and had information on all of the sites. And we've not been able to do that yet for reasons that everyone's familiar with. But once we have that, then we can programme an additional hearing session which will deal with those matters.
Thank you, sir. I'm grateful. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So, but Ms. Feeney will ensure that everyone is kept informed with progress, and that things are put onto the examination website. So I would like to close this hearing session today, and tomorrow we're dealing with employment in the morning, and then we've got a session on monitoring, and then we have we're going to hear from Dr. Andrew Boswell, who was unable to attend in the first week when he had been programmed to attend, and he'd done lots of work, and we're going to afford him some time to hear from him tomorrow afternoon after the monitoring session. So thank you very much, and we'll adjourn now, and we shall see those of you join us tomorrow. Thank you very much.
That's it.